A little bit of an introduction myself. Obviously, Neil Sleeman's my name, and it's Platinum Physiotherapy in Durham. I do know a lot of you, so it's worth saying hello to you, those that I do know and those that I haven't. But in terms of, I guess, why I love Beth's style in fencing is because Beth is an example of a person that's moved into modern day techniques, and I know that the fencers all do. So that's what we want to talk about today. What's the modern day approach to sports, to strength and conditioning, injury prevention? And bizarrely, the coronavirus has created a huge window for all people of all sports to do things the right way that they should have been doing before. And actually, the lockdowns created a huge amount of people now doing things properly. So we're seeing kind of two routes to injury. Just before I go a little bit more into the outline, over the lockdown, the person that's just gone full steam into running 7 times a week, because now they can, that person will get injured if they don't do any more strength work than what they did when they were running twice a week. And then you've got the other person who maybe is now coming back into their sport, like Beth said, without doing anything specific to the sport, and then that injury is waiting to happen. And they're pretty much the two injuries we're seeing. In terms of what we did, we moved everything to Video Link at the end of March at the point of lockdown. So we've had what we call business as usual in the Video Link world, treating all physiotherapy clients around the world now, as opposed to Durham. And we've got 50 strength and conditioning classes a week through the equivalent of Zoom, and that's by Video Link, and again, people from all around the world. So we're seeing people starting to take on that thought process about injury prevention and not just doing the sport. Fencing is a classic example with the social distancing problems. It would make sense to do something to build up the strength ready for that return to sport. And therefore, I think it's been pushed on fencers to take that responsibility, whereas runners and walkers and cyclists have probably had an easier way out because they can still do their sport and they've got to deal with the consequences if they don't do the strength work. So just a little bit about me. I'm a physiotherapist, obviously from Australia, qualified 24 years ago. I think I've given up count now. I've always been in and around sports, from pediatrics all the way up to elderly, all age groups, all levels of sport, including a multitude of professional teams and the 2000 Paralympics, where again, I saw a lot of fencers in that context as well. So it's been a sport that even though I don't take part to myself, I feel like I've always had links with fencers, and in Durham, it's been great to know Beth and Laszlo and other fencers up here. Our approach here, myself and the colleagues here, is very much about functional strength training. So we break that down. You strengthen for the sport. We don't now go to a gym and do 10 knee extensions on that leg extension machine because that leg extension machine is there. That's not going to help your fence any better. And I would argue strongly to anyone that would convince me otherwise. Obviously, gyms are shut at the moment, so it takes away that headache. But again, doing an exercise that's not relevant to the sport, it's just not how we do things. We specifically train, and that can be from the person at the elite level all the way down to the new beginner. And ironically, the new beginner tends to do better with strength work because they don't yet have those muscle control, those neurological pathways. They're not experienced enough in the sport. So the person that actually does a bit of strength and conditioning has a much easier journey into the sport. And of course, if you're at the higher level, then you should be doing that as part of it anyway. So that's a big part of what we're about. We're treating athletes worldwide, and it's nice to see that athletes around the world, sort of buy into this. So I thought today what we talk about is a little bit about fencing related stuff, the main muscle groups that are involved, which is very tricky with fencing because you could argue that compared to other sports, there's a lot more muscles used in fencing because of the nature of the sport, the forward, backwards, sideways direction. So we have a little bit of touching on the muscles. I think the common injuries, I promise I did not know about Beth's ankle sprain. I hadn't seen that video, but yes, at the top of the list is yours. So we'll talk about common injuries in 2 spheres: acute injuries, i.e. what you saw in that very impressive video that Beth showed us, and then the chronic injuries, acute injuries now and chronic obviously over a longer term. And it's important to separate them because the management can be very wrong if you don't separate what type of an injury it is. And then we'll go straight into talking about what we do with these injuries nowadays, the acute ones and the chronic ones, because it's very different to 20 years ago. And I hope at least one person in this room accepts that how we treated it then is not how we treat it now. It's really important to understand that to get an earlier return to sport. The rehabilitation starts 1 second after that injury, and that's just fact. Those people that get things sorted quickly get back to sport the earliest, and if that is going to hospital for that x-ray, you've already started the rehabilitation process. Then I thought we'd talk about the tips for training and injury prevention, which then comes into the strength and conditioning side. I'm here at the clinic here, so I've got loads of room around me. I've got foam rollers, I've got a Swiss ball, I've got some weights, I've got some kettlebells, and I've got some elastics. And between all these things today, if everyone's happy, I'll show you some fencing specific exercises that we will do for you, whether you're injured or not injured. And that should allow you some ideas to get some strength program in your own mind, which would make sense going in towards the fencing seasons ahead, and hopefully that's not far away. So if that's okay, I don't know, Beth, whether you want to ask if there's any other topics I should remember to add to the end of it.
So this is an opportunity, if you want to have a specific question to Neil, he's willing to, you know, he's here to talk specifically about your problem. So if obviously now you can say something, or if you want to put it in the chat, I will bring that up at the when we've got an opportunity.
Yeah. I have a recurring specific chronic problem, and that's typical of Sabers. It's tennis elbow.
Yep, we're talking about that in the injury center.
Okay, good.
Cannot find the chat. So my question would be, after lunging a lot, I get an ache on the inside of one leg, the forward leg, and occasionally when I twist, I get a clicking.
Yeah.
A click. Yeah.
That'll be covered in the knee injuries as well. So that
right.
Will be injuries and knees that are left out, and we can cover after. Yeah. Perfect. All right. So let's talk about the main muscle groups, and this is one that I thought I was going to have a pen and cross it off a bit like a tally system as people come up with the ideas. Lindsay, that is an excellent thing you just suggested. The constant warm up and cool down. Excellent. Don't let me leave without talking about that later. If I had to ask everyone to name the main muscle groups used in fencing, and we'll probably limit it at about 10, and I'll just take a mental note of any ideas. Any of the main muscle groups, either by chat or talking, I don't mind.
Yeah. I don't know the names. Quads.
Quads. Thigh muscles, definitely.
The shoulder.
Shoulder, rotator cuff, definitely.
Yeah.
Triceps.
Triceps, very good. And we've got core in general from Stuart. Well done. The core has come in early.
Fingers.
Fingers, yep. And we'll add the wrist and the forearm to that.
Yeah.
Which are often forgotten about. Any other big
back?
Back.
Heel.
I have no idea what this one is.
Shoulder, we'll call that under shoulder, Stuart. Yep.
Yeah, because it gets tired and then.
Yep. And I think that's a good starting point. So this is where it gets very messy because it's such a weird activity. It's not, you know, humans weren't designed as such with one side doing this and one side doing that. So fencing is a very tricky one because of the asymmetry. So certainly if we look at the neck down, your trapezius muscles are involved to hold that arm up. You've then got your deltoids holding your arm up. You've got the prod, so your pecs at the front, your chest muscles, they have to get involved. But then your back muscles have to retreat. So you've got some front back stuff happening there. Carol, spot on with the shoulder, rotate the cuff. If you're going to make that point, that where you want to be, that target, that's rotator cuff. So your shoulder muscles massively important. And if we go further down the arm, the forearm obviously attaches to the hand to allow you to hold the equipment. So you've got a plethora of injuries that happen in around the elbow, the forearm, tennis elbow and golfer's elbow, both occur in fencing. Go work that one out. But it's very true. There's a lot of forearm injuries. Then if we move down, and please Stuart brought the core in, which we'll talk about in a second, the best fencers in the world have the best core in the context of fencing because they've got the control. So yes, you want a strong core in every sport, but certainly fencing would be one, being a target-driven sport. And therefore, if you have a good central position, then obviously you're going to be more successful. Then if we move down to the lower leg, you've got the quads at the front of the thigh and the hamstrings. They both have to work because you're going forward and backwards. You've got your calves to give you that propulsion to make that attack, and therefore it brings in the lower body muscles. And I just put the groin in. People often forget about the groin. You're not symmetrical, so that groin muscle is going to have to work sideways, even though you're moving forwards and backwards. So compared to other sports, you can almost say that all of the major muscle groups are involved and they're all doing their own job for different reasons, which is where the core muscles in the stomach that we tend to say the stabilizers have a massive job. And therefore injuries to all of these areas is possible. So it's good that most people came up with some ideas there. So we talk about the common injuries. We'll go straight to that. And the acute injury. injury, what we'll call the Beth injury for the context of this talk. Obviously, 1 second before Beth rolled her ankle, she didn't know she was going to roll her ankle. That's an acute injury. And we talk about the most common fencing injuries, and you'll know someone that's had all of these. You've got your ankle twists, as you saw with Beth, the sprain in that direction is the most common. You've got the knee ligament injuries. People know people that have had cruciate ligament, medial ligament injuries because of the twist. And then we'll throw the meniscus injury, the knee cartilage, into that one as well. So they're your kind of lower leg common injuries, with the odd, broken leg sort of might come into there. We talk about muscle tears. You'll know someone that's had an acute tear. That will be calf, usually hamstring, quads, depending on how fast you're moving in the lower body. And Achilles ruptures does happen in fencers as a push-off sport. And it's important to note that Achilles history, as in an Achilles tendonitis that might be 10 years long, does not put you at any more risk of an Achilles rupture. In fact, in our experience, it's the opposite. The person with a long Achilles history normally has a weakness. They don't actually emit enough power to go near that Achilles rupture situation. The Achilles rupture is usually in the person in a racket sport or a push-off sport like fencing, whose power at the point is so good that their Achilles forgets to work properly, and by the time the power builds up, the Achilles is normally ruptured. So you can't predict an Achilles rupture, and it's always good to reassure people, if you strengthen yourself and you've got an Achilles history, you probably reduce your risk of an Achilles rupture even further. But of course, an Achilles rupture is still a risk of fencing. And then the other one.
I don't know, Neil, I just have to say, you've got me terrified. I don't want to fence anymore. This sounds way too dangerous. Okay, sorry.
Don't give up too early.
Screen so I can see you. There it is. Yep, perfect.
Don't give up. Don't give up.
I have actually seen someone rupture their Achilles during a fencing match at an international competition. And in case people weren't around, it was Carol Wengraf.
I remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do.
It was
horrible.
Semi-final.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They said-
remember it.
Yes, horrible,
Stay
horrible.
with you forever, they say.
Yeah.
Can I ask something? My fencers used to complain about back pain, to the back, the spine and down. So when they're moving forward, backwards, or leaning forward, they're complaining too much. So is any special thing how you can make the back specific to train, to being stronger or more?
We'll be talking a lot about that when we get to the
Yeah.
exercises for sure. So they're the main exercise, but I wanted to add one more acute one, is the bruising injury of the sport. So it is possible that you could get a strike as a defensive position. You might have the equipment in the right place and all of that, but that could change the way you fence. That could then cause another injury. So it's not unusual in a contact sport, fencing or rugby, that a simple bruise can then cause a subsequent injury. So you can have an acute and then that turns into another injury. So that's one to be careful with. And that's where the foam roller, this little thing that we'll talk about later, does come into play. So if you do get a blow or a bruising injury and it turns into a nasty little area, you can use the foam roller to prevent another injury. And that's quite common in fencing there. So they're the main acute injuries. In terms of what do we do with them? Well, Beth's already helped you along. We don't rest. Has everyone heard of the RICE acronym from about the 1600s?
Mhm.
Yeah, that went out about then. So rest, ice compression, elevation, no more. It went to RICER and then it went to PRICER because they kept on adding acronyms. But actually now we call it police. And that's why we don't use the RICE. The rest has been taken away because rest is the worst thing you can do for 99% of injuries. And the ones that actually truly rest are the ones that go to hospital, find the broken arm or the broken leg, and it's an enforced rest because they're about to be in plaster or they're about to have surgery. In our view, as a very aggressive sports physiotherapy group of people around me, we hardly ever get anyone to rest. When you're resting from the sport, your strength work that we'll talk about will actually go up. So how can you call it rest if I'm asking you to do 200 squats a day, broken up in sets of 20 over the course of the day? I wouldn't call that rest, and therefore we don't use rest for an acute injury. The ice is important, we'll talk about that in a second, but the police is something worth remembering, and I will forward the information for Beth to circulate. P for protect. So obviously in fencing, there's a protection element. So P looks after itself. If we talk about the OL, that's optimal loading. Optimal loading means weight bear as soon as possible if there's a reason to weight bear. Unless there's a reason not to weight bear, as in a broken leg, then you wait there. So Beth, by not being on the crutches, and similar to what she talked about previous, has already accelerated her recovery to full return to sport by optimally loading a new injury. I'm guessing you didn't go to hospital and have an x-ray, Beth, from what you were saying?
Yes, I had to wait around. I had to have an X-ray, and then they issued me with a cast, a quite expensive cast, like a air cast and crutches, and then just told me to continue.
Is this the new injury or the previous injury?
The new injury. So when I first really did my ankle at the Commonwealths, I got an X-ray, and then they just put an air cast on me, and then told me to walk on crutches, and they gave me that was it. But obviously, while I was there was quite a bit of time. Obviously, it was time before I went to the hospital because of the urine test. There wasn't very good medical facilities from what I can remember, because all I did was lying on the ground and my legs up in the air. And then getting back, there's nothing afterwards. And we had a team event that we were preparing for. And if I couldn't get a medal if I didn't fence in the team event. So I had to develop a whole new strategy of how to stand there and take 5 parries, which I pretty much did. I took 4 parries and I lost 5 for my match. So I did pretty well. And then I had the British fencing physiotherapist, because I was on a level of support funding, and then she just got me sorted out really well. But I had problem with pitting. It was obviously very swollen for a long time. The blood had pooled up, so my ankle was, for at least a week, was fully, and it was pitted, so you could write my name in my ankle. And so we had to deal with an awful lot more problems, I think, than I should have if it was managed better at the time.
Yeah, air cast is an interesting one. My personal view on the air cast is that too many people have put into them without justification. In a perfect professional sense, you would have an ultrasound scan or an MRI scan on a new ankle ligament sprain to put someone in an air cast, because if it's not the damage that is perceived, the air cast would actually cause stiffness and weakness. So that's one to be careful of. But if you're weight bearing, then that starts the ball rolling anyway, as opposed to being on crutches. So optimal loading in an air cast, I'm happy to have my arm twisted if they felt the ligament was unstable, but really we want that walking as soon as possible. And then the ice and the compression, the elevation, which used to be in rice, still exists. So hopefully Beth is definitely icing now that we know that she's in an air cast. Obviously the compression is still used, even though some people don't believe it works. I still think it does. If someone needs compression, they need compression. The elevation is one that I don't tend to think works that much anymore, because we're too busy getting people stronger. So if it's a new injury and you can use the foam roller on the calf, or you can start to do some strength work through the calves up and down on the toes, you're not elevating and you're getting it better. So elevation sometimes gives people the wrong message. It's just that when you do ice it, it's better to ice it in an elevated position. But it's not a green light to elevate in lieu of the strength work that needs to be done. So just think about that acronym, how it's changed, and people that put in that early rehab work get the best results there with the early management is the strength work. So getting the early diagnosis is crucial. Hospital, GP, physio, whoever's involved, to give you a diagnosis, then to get the strength in early on, particularly if it's a fencing specific injury, which is where Beth's is an easy one to get that return to training journey. Any questions about the acute injuries there? All okay? Yep, excellent. Just go in the chat if need be, and I'll keep an eye on that. Now let's go to the chronic injuries. These are the ones that build up. You know there's something in the background, and it might be there one day, 1 week, or 1 year before you realise, and then eventually you know there's something going on. Back pain is probably the top of the tree, so it's good that Laszlo mentioned that. Back pain is probably the one we see most in the fences. A lot of that is down to change in level as well as change in equipment. As people get better, they might fence better, so they're placing more demands on key muscles, and the back can be the victim of that. If we talk about what the back tends to time with is hamstring problems, a lot of people find if they've got a stiff back, then the muscles at the back of the thigh get dragged into that. And it can be sort of a rock and a hard place. The stiffer the back, the tighter the hamstrings, and they just go backwards and forwards. But again, we've got things we'll talk about today that will help to prevent that. You certainly don't have to have back pain being a fencer at any different level. That's important. look at the groin tightness as a chronic injury. Particularly if the back is stiff, you might be using your groin muscles to push you along the runway there and back. So that's another injury area there. And that can be in the side groin muscles, what we call the adductors, or it can be at the front of the thigh, which we call the hip flexors. But we tend to call them all the groin. They're different muscles, but very close by. If we talk about the knee, I think I didn't see who asked the knee question before, but that's another common one, and that doesn't have to be a twisting injury. You can have a chronic build-up of knee pain, similar to what you mentioned. A lot of the time it's what they call jumper's knee, which is the patellar tendinitis, and that's at the front of the kneecap, either above or below the kneecap. The patellar tendon, as it launches you forward, is the same tendinitis that basketballers and volleyballers get, and fencers get that as well, particularly on their leading knee as they're pushing themselves forward. So that's one to be wary of. The Achilles problems at the calf, obviously you push yourself forward. A lot of people have Achilles tightness, and that can turn into a chronic tendinitis, usually on one leg, obviously the leg that's loaded more often there. And then the shoulder ones, a lot of people don't recognize the shoulder pain with that position. It's very easy to get those long-term shoulder injuries on your striking arm there, and you want to pick that up as early as possible. We'll talk about how you fix that using the foam roller, so rotator cuff tendinitis. And then the forearm ones, which people touched on, you get a huge amount of problems because of the grip that you have, different equipment, different types of sword, and therefore there's two main ones we see. You got the true tennis elbow, which is on the outside, which is to do with the muscles on this side of the arm, the gripping. And then you've got the golfer's elbow, which is on the opposite side, which is to do with the muscles on the other side of the forearm. And both of those two tendinitises are due to the way people grip. And we often find a lot of those grip injuries are more related to the weaknesses elsewhere. And in the end, your wrist and forearm muscles try and do everything instead of letting your core, your shoulder, your back, all the big muscles don't do their job. So again, it's quite an easy one to nip in the bud to work out where it's coming from, if it's not an equipment issue. And most fencers are savvy enough to know, is it an equipment issue or is it a body issue if they've got a severe elbow pain there. So they're the main chronic injuries there. If we talk about in an umbrella, what do we do? Well, for chronic, even more so you don't rest, because there's not usually the inflammatory component of a new injury. So if you've got a new injury, a really big twist, we know that the best big bruised, swollen ankle is an inflammatory component. She's got to get the ice to get that injury under control and still strengthen it. But the chronic ones don't tend to have that problem. So the person who rests a chronic injury absolutely delays their recovery. The typical case we have from runners is they might have an Achilles problem. It's not an acute injury. They didn't twist or fall. It's just built up. So they rest for 1 week. Of course, it feels better when they're resting because they're doing nothing. There's no test. So they come back for the next run, and believe it or not, it's the same pain and often worse. So then they rest for 2 weeks, and then they do the same because it's the same pain and often worse, and they go to 3 weeks. And at no point in time does the penny drop that of course it's painless when they're resting. Not because it's getting better, because they're not doing anything. And of course, the weakness by this time is getting worse and worse and worse. The tightness is getting worse and worse and worse. So rest for a chronic injury is by far the worst thing you can do. If we're talking about actual fencing, well, you wouldn't fence 6 times a week with a chronic injury if you're doing no strength work in the background. But as you do your strength work, our philosophy is we often tell people to go out and have that run straight away. After we treated it, after you've done some strength work in the clinic, go and have a 20-minute run. Not fast, but just go and have a 20-minute run and then feed back to me. And if it was still painful, we know you're not strong enough, but you haven't made the long-term outcome any worse. You just know that you're not strong enough yet. So now you will go and do those 200 repetitions a day, if that's what we agree, or 100, whatever we agree. And then in 2 days' time, let's go and have another run. Fencing a little bit trickier, being an explosive sport. We're not going to let someone go to full training from a chronic injury straight away, but you can still do things at training, and that's important. We find that socially, emotionally, the mental health benefits of sport. If someone's at training and it can be modified, why wouldn't you do it with a chronic injury? You'll still be able to do something 9 times out of 10. And then the example that we have here, we're very much in the gymnastics world with a lot of the clubs. Pretty much every patient we have from the gymnastics club is at training when they're injured. They just have specific boundaries of what they can do, and that's all the way up to broken legs in plasters. So if we can get someone doing core work at gymnastics with their 10 teammates, that's a win-win for everyone, and it should be hopefully fencers can see. Just a little bit tricky with the equipment side, but again, that's a sport issue rather than a physio issue. And sometimes people do the strength work better at training when they're around others than trying to do it in the house themselves with the distractions of life around. So sometimes the best place to do strength work is actually at training. So I hope that makes sense about why we don't rest.
Yeah, I can add to that. It's a nice resonance there, because my other sport is squash, and with fencing and squash, with that forward motion, I get a tendonitis every now and again on the front of my shoulder, and so I got my exercise. So I do this on the squash court. So if I feel there's a problem coming where my forehand is painful, I just do this exercise on court with my racket. So I'm pulling on my back to condition my back. It helps hugely, and that's immediate. So if I feel a problem on the squash court, I do that, and it goes away. I know I have to deal with it a lot more, but I can actually deal with these problems live, so it isn't a problem anymore.
Yeah. I think that ties in nicely for the question that Lindsay asked about the fencing being an explosive sport, stop, start, heats, finals. It is very tricky. How do you manage that warm up, cool down? And I guess now we probably don't really see it as a warm up or cool down. It takes people the wrong direction about temperature and circulation. When a muscle tightness is not really down to warming up and cooling down. Is your muscle that not ideal length or at an ideal length? The next bit I'm going to talk about probably helps, and that's the foam roller. As a lot of you know, would be the advocates of the foam roller, and that's because in the 20 years that I've been a physio, the foam roller, it's just completely come in, over those 20 years, previously reserved for elite athletes, and then about, I think, 10 or 12 years ago, physios like myself, well, why should this be just for elite athletes? Some of our best foam roller people are not athletic at all, but they know they can sort their muscle tightness out so well with this. The foam roller has in effect replaced stretching. So people that stretch and have access to a foam roller, I say, what are you trying to achieve? And the reason I'll talk about the foam roller, particularly with Lindsay's question, is if you know you've got one knot in your calf and you're halfway through a competition that might go for a whole weekend, if I stand up and I'll just do a simple calf stretch from side on, just a simple calf stretch, I might get a stretch from there to there, the whole way down. And it'll feel nice, and I'll give myself a pat on the back for feeling good stretch. But what happens if my problem that I feel every hit is in one point? I haven't really influenced that point. Whereas the foam roller, the idea is in much the same way that physios have to treat people to get the knots out, is I can go to that point. I might cross one leg over if I'm strong enough. I might have two legs on the roller if I'm not. And I go to that point, I find that the spot, which we call the pain, and the tightness of the roller can be addressed immediately. The time used on the foam roller is far less than stretching, because you're on the spot. And my line to a lot of my patients is, you can get more out of a foam roller in 20 seconds than you can with 10 minutes of stretching. And therefore that helps in the training, it helps in competition, because you can just keep on top of that tightness. And that's really important. So as injury prevention, at the very minimum for fencers, even if they didn't do strength and conditioning work, we would encourage you less stretching, more foam rolling, which bizarrely will take a lot less time, but then allows you to train smarter and better. And so in terms of foam roller, we do use it head to toe. I know some people have done our foam roller class that we show people. We use it for people with headaches. We use it for people with back pain. Some of the fencing muscles that we would encourage you to use, I'll just show you some of the ones that I've made a note of. The shoulder on your striking arm. If you've got good shoulder flexibility and you're under the armpit, you just simply rotate there to there. And you would normally find a knot. It would just feel like a physio pressing that shoulder. You would compare it to the other side, and therefore, as long as a difference exists, you're on the right spot. If we're talking about the mid-back, so it heads down to what Laszlo was saying, a lot of back tightness in fencing because of the nature of the sport. You lift your bottom up and you do small movements. Again, comparing left and right, that's really important. If we go down to the lower body, a lot of calf muscle activity, which we talked about, crossing one leg over the other or not. And then the quads at the front, another big muscle. Particularly if you've had knee pain, you can do both legs on the roller, or again, cross one leg over the other. And you're just looking for that knot forward and backwards. So it's very important to get the technique right. The people that foam roll after training, particularly when things are tight, will always wake up looser the next day, which will then make their training better thereafter. The injury prevention of a foam roller is therefore easy to explain to people. If your muscles after training aren't like this, and they're like this, and they're looser, then if your next training session is the day after that, and Laszlo, for instance, says this is going to be the most intense fencing session you're going to do, I would rather be that person than that person. And the people who get the tightness out the soonest after the training session have the better outcomes, because if you go to bed after that previous training session and you wake up the next morning with tightness in that muscle, whichever one I showed you, then it's much harder to get that tightness out at a later date. And again, that's replaced stretching, and that's a really important part of it. So hopefully there's a little bit of foam roller, things happening out there. It's just getting your head around it. The studies that have shown that stretching has probably never prevented injury, we agree with those studies. There's been enough studies over the last 20 years, and some of them have been as much as big cohorts of army recruits with mountain boots and miles of walking, weights on their back, and actually the non-stretching groups actually often perform better than the stretching groups, probably because the stretching groups are doing stretching instead of something else that could have prevented injury. So that's an important part. The stuff I said to people, the butt, sometimes it's not easy to get on a foam roller. You may have wrist issues and all those things, that's okay. And sometimes it doesn't feel right to be on a foam roller, so you can stretch in the middle of a competition or people around you. That's okay as well. So I don't expect everyone at Durham Park Run to be foam rolling at the finish line. I would love it if it happened, but maybe that's an example where stretching is better than nothing. But then when the person gets home, I would like them to be using the foam roller. So any questions about the loosening side of things, which is what the foam roller and the stretching comes into?
Yeah, what you're saying about the foam roller, would you say that applies to hamstring injuries as well?
Yeah. So that foam roller is accessible to everywhere. The hamstring's a tricky one, because that's right, you had your hamstring question, is that the foam roller needs to be quite firm to get the hamstring, because the hamstring's a very soft muscle. So without giving a full foam roller lesson today, I'll just go back a little bit more. I've got the foam roller under one hamstring, crossing one leg over the other, and I would look for where that tightness is with the foot up in the air. And because the hamstring is a very fleshy muscle, you have to work a little harder to find it. But once you find it, you would compare it to the other side. And the use of the foam roller in the context of your question is, a lot of people sweep. They go up and down the foam roller and they say, look at me, I'm the best foam roller in the world. But every time I get to that knot, I'm just going to keep sweeping away from it. They're going away from the tightness in the context of your injury. The best foam roller people go straight to the dartboard, find the center of that 50, and they just stay on that knot, and they just go like that. So
I think mine is very close to the knee, on the outside of the knee.
So then you should find that quite easy.
So stretching seemed to have helped so far, but it came to a plateau where it won't get any better. It's a lot better, but it's around 1.5 years old now, and it seems to get to a point that it won't get any better. So
2 questions that have to be asked there. Number one, on the tightness front, has the stretching got to the point of the injury that the foam roller example would be? And the second thing is, what strength work are you doing specifically for your hamstring injury? That should be done after it's loosened off with previously stretching and now foam rolling. And if I had to hedge my bets, I'm guessing number 2 would be a question worth asking, because 1.5 years in the absence of an injury needing a scan to rule out a full thickness tear, which would be surgery, then you have to have full improvement well within 1.5 years with every hamstring injury, because you can strengthen that muscle so quickly. So one of the exercises I'll be showing in a couple of minutes is for hamstring injuries in the fencer. So it's one that I would be starting there. Any other questions there about the loosening side of things?
I could have quite a lot.
Cool.
I have quite a lot. I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But maybe difficult to answer. One of them, as a coach aspect,
Yep.
how should I know if one of my fencer it can get injury? how serious it is. Shall I tell, oh, just carry on, or okay, just stop, wait, and how can I detect whether or not, how serious it is? And the other thing, how the special person should know it's okay now to continue the action. So maybe get some small injuries or pull the muscle or something. Okay, I'm fine. And should I say, okay, stop, don't do anything? Or I said, guy, okay, I keep carry on, and eventually just crack the muscle. So how can I detect how serious the injury is?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I won't go too deep because that's a topic for a whole day, I promise. But
I know, yes, I know. So that I'm worried about that.
It brings in the psychology of the coach-athlete relationship, which is again something a big.
But many fans should be problems. Okay, I'm fine. I can keep carry on, and just after get even serious injury. So it's very important to know the person how could what he can do or what she can do.
I think the best answer, look at Beth's injury as the obvious case in point. Obviously, you knew something had happened. It was obvious and it was on video as well. But Beth's priorities at that point is to start the rehab of the ankle. So that's a no-brainer. Beth doesn't need to be training the rest of that day because she's got some really important things to do. One, getting an x-ray, and number two, starting the rehab. The person that's the more muscle strain is tricky, and that's where the athlete and the coach would have to obviously have that chat. You know, did they feel something overstretch or tear? What's it like now in the moment? You'll be able to see how they're moving around, and then the intensity of the training session would come into play. So if it was an intense training session, you'd obviously be a little bit more cautious. If there was a bit of technique work that wasn't that intense, then it may be that they would continue at a pace that was reasonable. They're still going to have to do the icing anyway, but I think you'll find that to have a black and white approach will be a bad thing, because you're going to have two athletes, the one that will literally fence until their leg is amputated, and the other athlete that will stop training at the point that they cut their fingernail. And I'm not saying it's that extreme, that you have to consider both scenarios, the one that's cautious and the one that's very stubborn in a good way. But obviously if Beth continued fencing on that day, Beth would not have woken up too good the next morning. So I think it's just that conversation. What did they feel? How are they moving? What's happening now a minute after the injury? And normally the decision kind of takes itself. So you don't have to feel like you're forcing the decision on them, because it becomes logical between two people.
Just a quite common example what happens. So many times fans make an extra long lunge, and the front leg is sliding forward, not like bad stop, but sometimes it's landing the heel, the shoe not properly good, sliding forward and make a very put a muscle in the hamstring, and after start stumbling, I feel pain, but I'm okay, okay. So it's quite common injury. So maybe just a little bit just overstretched, but maybe next time even worse if it's happen again. So that's why I'm interested about this. Where's the point when should I say stop, don't do anything, or okay, just walk a little bit, next time get a little ice and after keep carry on. So it's very tricky question. So big responsibility as well.
Yeah, I think for that kind of situation, you'd be cautious because you don't want to re-tear it a minute later. If they had a hamstring history of tightness and it didn't feel too much worse than what they've always had, and the intensity could be controlled, then it could be an argument to say, I think we can work on the technique. So sometimes people can train a little bit longer in that session than maybe what they think, but a lot of that will be fear. And then obviously you need to make that decision.
And I have another question. Somebody get injury and have a break, maybe a week, 10 days or something. How will I know, the person should know when is the point when he should start again to practice, or because the pain still there. So it's not gone, but where's the point? How can feel when you feel okay, I'm start again, I can do it again, I'm getting is any idea, measure how people mentally believe in it, okay, I'm fine, or maybe start too early and after even go back the injury. So it's dangerous.
Easy question to answer because of how things have changed in the 20 years of being a physio. For me, 20 years ago, we would have said hamstring tear must be out for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on which Premier League manager you talk to. And I used to say that in the media. How long will he be out for after the match? 6 weeks. I won't use the word that's in my mind, but it's not true, because one person decides the speed of that recovery, and it's the athlete involved, the person that gets the ice on it straight away, the person that starts the strength work. And then the test that we do allows them to have, you have that answer, Laszlo. So for that injury, if the person starts the strength work early, then the criteria might be they might need to jog before they come back and do some training. It won't be full training, but they can do some. Then if it's a leg injury like Beth's, right, Beth, when can you hop on that leg because you've been doing your strength work? I can now hop, I'm pain-free. Right, so now your training's going to be at 80%. And therefore the re-entry into training becomes less of an issue, because they're probably at training earlier, doing a modified training session that you've agreed, and the physio would often be involved in that, where we give our athletes a sheet saying, this is what you're allowed to do. And we don't care if you're feeling fine, you still aren't allowed to do that until we know that you can do this. So the actual return to training is a lot quicker. Whereas if the person stays at home and rests and waits for that injury to get better, they will absolutely injure themselves on that return to training, because there's no justification for when full training take place. So for you to be helped, your athlete has to help you by doing the strength work, set some criteria, between you, and then at that first training session, you and the athlete understand it's not a green light for full training, because it's modified for a reason. Does that make sense?
By the way, it's just a very good example. The fencing is somehow a good, very good sport, some aspect. If you're injured with your leg, you can work with your arm. If you work with a problem with your arm, you can work with your leg. The best example for Stuart, sitting there in the right side, he had a problem with the elbow. It's a very serious tennis elbow issue. After thumb, and after that he turned to the left hand. And he played for years with left hand, and he did very well. And after later on turned back to the right. So fencing can replace the problem each other. So luckily.
Absolutely. Now,
I just joking with Beth. She should sit in the wheelchair and can practice, because she can work with hand, not with leg. But at the moment, no wheelchair as well.
Yeah. Now we'll go to the strength bit of it. And a lot of athletes, we find, more so nowadays, because we're much bigger in the strength world than 20 years ago, have improved performance after most injuries. Why? Because they've had to do the strength work to get better. On that journey, they build up more muscle strength and other key muscles, possibly in the second leg that wasn't injured, and now their performance is better. So most people with a running injury that we've never seen here before that do parkrun will do a parkrun PB within a month of returning to parkrun. Why? Because 5 kilometers is very predictable. If the injuries heal perfectly from our point of view and they've done strength work, then even a 1% increase in muscle strength should trigger a PB on the basis that their cardio fitness is the same. If they haven't rested, then they won't have lost the cardio fitness, and fencing should be no different. Most athletes with a fencing injury should have an increased performance if the layoff hasn't been too long. So always bear that in mind. You're not doing the strength work to get in over your injury, you're doing the strength work to become a better fencer, and it's a really good thing to take on board. So I'm going to show you some of the exercises, and sorry, the hamstring question, sorry, Simone, that's who it was, yeah. So I'm going to show you some hamstring stuff. And just put this up here. So lunges and reverse lunges are well known. Obviously in fencing, you've got a lot of reasons to be lunging for. So I'm side on, and I've just grabbed a couple of kettlebells here. So certainly from a strength and conditioning point of view, you don't have to bend this knee this far, obviously in fencing. That's just a normal forward lunge. From side on, the reverse lunge is very good. If you think about the work you're doing, going forwards and backwards, if I were to do this as an exercise a couple of times a week, a little bit of it's a hamstring strength exercise, Simone. So straight away, rather than hamstring curls, because you don't fence like this, that doesn't make much sense. The reverse lunge is a much better functional exercise. Obviously, if you add the weights in, you can load it up a little bit more. However, and a lot of people know that our passion is the Swiss ball. The Swiss ball is not just used for back pain, but for sport-specific strength. So if I'm a fencer and I want to have good hamstring strength, good quad strength for the front leg, and good core control, from a side on, I'm just going to hold on to the wall because I'm looking at you. Why not do some lunges in this position? Now, as I get better, and I can take the hand and put it on my hips. However, if if I want to go a bit further, I'm going to bring the elastics in. If I put the elastics behind my back, so I've got some resistance, I'm going to find a shape similar to what I'm fencing. Now remember, I'm not a fencer, so the angles will be a little bit out. I'm looking at the camera, but that's really a great way to build up sport-specific strength. Loads of weight going through this muscle to support, but that way making sure that my hands are being kept honest. There's an upper body component, and I can change the angles. And of course, the core is in the middle of this, because the only way that I can talk to you, looking my head at 90 degrees, doing this random exercise, is to feel my core. And there's no coincidence that that's the muscle I feel most. So that would be an example of a sport-specific exercise, bringing in about 4 muscle groups, 5 of you with grip of the elastic, but you can use it for injury rehab, but we would use it as strength and conditioning. So that's a really good example.
So Bulgarian split squat, right?
Yep, split squat. Yep, or side. We've got a lunge on the Swiss ball, but split squat, same thing.
Yeah.
If I haven't got the Swiss ball, could I put my leg on a sofa?
Absolutely.
Or something about the same level?
Yep.
Like
And
a
you would
soft
do it
surface.
as long as possible to make it as hard as possible, but obviously you would have to see how stable you were. Now, the reason we talk about the Swiss ball, and I've got 2 more positions to show on the Swiss ball, which is why we're passionate about it. In fencing, are you static or are you moving? That's the question you've got to ask yourself. So to do it on the settee, for instance, with a static settee is good, but what happens if your opponent moves 1 degree in any direction? Your settee strength won't come in. And that's where static strength and dynamic strength are so different. Therefore, if you do it on a moving object, which we tend to use the Swiss ball, it will be much better. And that's why most elite athletes would be all over that kind of object in their normal training, because fencing is such a dynamic sport. And you do lots of different squats. For instance, instead of doing a forward-backwards one, another one we do, which is again possibly specific to fencing, is to do a sideways. So I'm pushing the ball with that leg. So he's working on the glutes. This leg's working to stay stable, as it has to when you're fencing. And again, you could have the same upper body tasks there. So that's an example there. Another position that people don't realize is very effective for fencers is where you go onto your front. And that's because if you look at the angle of your arm to the body, there's a nice little right angle that is thereabouts. Obviously, again, you will know the angles better than me. But if I go onto my front and I lie over the ball, I've got my arms going down that way. We call this a reverse plank. Now, a reverse plank just means instead of having my hands on the ball, as it were, I'm in a plank position. This position itself allows me to use my core muscles, but the angle is very similar to the fencing. So now that opens up a huge amount of exercises. I might want to build up my strength in one leg. I'm going to lift one leg off the ball using my core. So again, Simone, hamstring strength. The leg lifting up off the ball, that's all hamstring with the core helping. The leg on the ball has to stabilize. I might have a problem with an upper body, or I might have weakness. So why don't we do some press-ups in that same position to get used to pushing ourselves to make the strike? And again, you're using your core muscles there. You can do other exercises where you might want to build up the leg strength dynamically. And so we do the swim kick, all in this reverse plank position. And then occasionally go a little bit higher level, and you might have 2 legs off the ground. I'll look down for this one, and this might be my fencing arm. So why wouldn't I practice that movement? Because the muscle strength around the core has to be very strong for me to lift 3 things off the ground. But the benefit would be in the moment of the competition, that strength will allow me to make that thrust there. So the other position that we use for fencers is on our back. Similar type of theory. When you lie on the back, in this position, the body nice and straight. So again, you're thinking about the fencing. Let's go to a single arm exercise. If I was having trouble with a shoulder problem and I was right-handed, why don't I do some shoulder, chest strength work? Lying on the ball is just a simple up and down movement, and it's much more specific because my core muscles are involved. So all of those things are, very important. And there's something you can do every day. They're not exercises that would take days to recover, whereas in the past you would go to a gym, lift the heaviest weights you can, have 3 days off and go and do it all over again. That's not how we look at it. You know, we want you to be able to do something every day there. Any other questions before I show you one more? That's another example. Yep. So the next one.
Sorry. Do you also use single leg Romanian deadlifts?
Yes.
As well?
Yep. That's another one. Yep. Brilliant. Yep.
Right.
So, yep. Loads and loads. Yep. So with the hamstring work, I'll just go from here. So we're going to drop one leg down, and the other leg going that way, and then coming back up. Yep. And I think you can say that's not as sport specific as the others because of the position you're going to, but the actual muscle that you're strengthening in the context of the up and down the runway, that's fine.
So you're keeping the standing leg absolutely straight?
Yeah, we try and say the smallest bit of bend as possible, because if you put it into a squat, then you change the exercise.
Yeah. I find it super hard to keep my legs straight. My body starts to, but I'm working on it.
But that's the idea of the exercise, to maintain that single leg stability. Yep. And another one that is in the same sphere in the upper body, again, if you had a weak shoulder or overuse injury, using that ball being a moving object, doing little circles, and it doesn't have to be a Swiss ball. Grab a football, something that's round against the wall. Keep your elbows straight, so you're trying to mimic that position. And now you're pushing as hard as you can. You'll feel it in your core, because that's what's doing the work. And we'll make it a little bit harder. Lift one leg up. So one leg off the ground. It's as if I'm mid-direction in the context of a competition. And if you did that with your fencing arm on the ball, you would build up good power, core muscles, talking to the arm muscles, and the one leg off the ground is the icing on the cake, because then everything has to work together. So there's a huge amount that we can do. People ask about how often with that kind of approach, and this is where it gets a little bit messy depending on the intensity of the session, of the person involved. So people that do really good weight-led strength and conditioning sessions probably only need to do 2 a week maximum of the really big weights. And in between, they'll be doing their cardio, their fencing, their foam rolling, and then they go and do another big weight session. If it's more stability stuff like what I've shown you, then that is an absolute everyday. You're not going to hurt yourself doing any of the exercise I've shown you, and you'll build up your core relatively quickly in a short duration at time at home every day. So 5 to 10 minutes of that kind of stuff, you would just see an incremental increase, because you would never have to worry about recovering, because the next session will be possible the next day. And then that's just sort of your own journey into strength world is led. Which way am I trying to build up stability? Am I trying to build up power? And obviously there's going to be bits of both, depending on what you are. If you're a weak fencer that lacks power, then of course we may go down the power route. If you feel that you're quite strong but your control's a bit off at times, you just don't get to where you want to be, and maybe you lose a few matches that way, then maybe the core route would be the route that we would say, let's worry about that. But when we do things with the Swiss ball, like single leg squats, you're doing both anyway. So, include the core whenever you can would be my advice. Now, any questions about the strength exercise? I didn't want to rewrite any of Beth's favourite exercises for S&C, but that's purely from a physio point of view. So, Beth,
I've just been chatting. Well, I've been chatting to Stuart just in the background, because Stuart and I do lead on. We host 5 sessions a week. So Stuart does 3, I do 2, and you've pretty much covered all of them that are included in the session at some time. Certainly. That's why Stuart's questions were particular, because half our session is based on strength and conditioning, and the other half is based on technique and tactics specific to fencing. So it's quite comforting on what you've just said.
Yeah. And there's always variations. We come up with exercises all the time, and if you know the sport, that's the best place to make up those exercises. And if you know what you're looking for, it's safe.
The variations have been interesting, so I think we will put our heads together based on what people have available. That's been our experience with some of our attendees, of which are in this room at the moment. So it's good.
Well, can I say,
my created amazingly for us, you know, we've increased our classes compared to the studio down the road by a third because of the video link. Now, we know number one is people at home, so it's a little bit more accessible if they're in lockdown, as it were. But the second thing is the perception of equipment. We've really taken that away. And our hardest session for our sports fit people that do this kind of session was using 4 rolls of toilet paper.
I saw that one. It was excellent.
By far the hardest session I've ever done in my life, because doing press-ups over 4 rolls laid up in a row, or jumping over 4 rolls, or jumping side to side, touching 2 and 2. You know, it's very easy with body weight stuff. And we're not doing it as a boot camp. It's not a cardio, it's a strength goal. And that's something I think the lockdown has created. People do actually get it, even though kettlebells are very well bought in the last 3 months. You don't have to have them. There's stuff around the house, buckets, books, rocks, they're all there. And we've not had anyone really need to go and invest in equipment, because actually it was always there. It was just no one was at home long enough to see that it was there. And that's important. So that could be a really good character, is pick something that could be fencing related, that doesn't have to be the sword, obviously, and create a session plan around that, because everyone's had a lot of fun when we tell them they need a broomstick this week. That's perfect.
Excellent, thank you. So,
Neil,
Neil's to Carol.
yeah, one thing for me is getting the motivation. It's really very hard, but I mean, what you said about if you did 10 minutes a day, I know I have to work on stability, and I know the balance and stability are the things that are really, really important. That if I could improve those, I could improve my fencing quite a lot. But as you get older, this is harder, because you lose balance very easily, and that's why people have falls and things as they get older. So any kind of exercises that have to do with stability and being able to sort of hold a lunge, you know, any tips on that would be very welcome. But I think I need to do it every day, don't I?
Yeah, but this is where you flip over from almost a sports-led program to a, I don't know, use the word normal person, because it sounds wrong, but a daily program, is that becomes a kettle boiling approach. Every time your kettle is boiling, when you're brushing your teeth, then why aren't you doing 10 squats on each leg? Because that's the little and often approach that will work better. So you don't actually have to think about it, and you won't feel guilty for not doing it, because it just becomes habit. And therefore, once you start getting stronger in the single leg squat, because you have 5 cups of tea a day, then the strength sessions with Beth will feel much more achievable. And so that to me smells of flip the sports side away, think about the falls prevention side, which is what we tell people to do over the age of 60 anyway, and then you can get your strength back at a pace that you're comfortable with, and then that'll flip you back into the sports strength thing. So that's what I would do. Go for kettle single leg squats and single leg calf raises. Let's keep the calves
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
Okay, for the hip one, my clicky hip, what would I do on a roller for that?
Is it painful, the clicky hip, or just click?
No, it's just annoying. You know, it's like it's clicking out and clicking in. When I'm lunging a lot, then I get an ache there. Now, normally I stretch after doing exercises anyway, and I do a side stretch. You know, pushing my leg out to the side to stretch that part.
Yeah. Do you have a foam roller at home yourself?
I have, yes.
I'll show you the exercise on foam roller I would try. Obviously, we can't diagnose in the context of the history, but the fact that it's not painful when it's clicking, we actually aren't worried about that type of clicking painless hip. However, obviously it does ache, so we have to be wary. There might be some pain lurking. Therefore, the strength route would be the thing I would be focusing on, because if it's not a sharp pain every time it clicks, it smells
it's not doing anything but clicking.
Yeah, so we actually would look at the lunge work, the stability work on the exercise, lots and lots of them, because actually if you build up the strength, the muscles around the bit that is the clicky bit's often the tendon just kind of floating backwards and forwards. It's usually not the joint in the absence of pain. you build up the muscles around it, and therefore you would expect the clicking to change that.
I thought
So-
somebody told me that I'm too tight there and need to stretch it.
Yeah,
But
and
you
that's
think it's the opposite.
Well, the stretching conversation, it comes into play then, because if it's too tight, then why isn't it painful every time it does that? So
It's not.
I would call it a weakness on the basis of what you told us. But in terms of the hip, depending on where it is, because there's two tendons.
It's on the inside.
Is yours
on
on
the inside.
So that's more groin related, which would be
Sorry, it's groin related. Sorry.
which is not to do with the hip joints. That takes the hip out of the picture already. You can foam roll the groin, but I would be even less inclined to worry about the roller based on what you told us, and go back to that single leg strength work. And maybe you need to have more of a sidewards lunge or sideways squat. So you might have, I don't know, something heavy in the pantry, heavy knees, and you could do a side lunge. I'll just go to that. And we're doing this for strength, not for stretching. And if that was the bad leg, you could stretch it out at the same time. However, if that was the bad leg, that's the one I would focus on to make this leg work better when it's
right.
So
Side good.
Makes sense.
Good. Yeah, like that. Thank you very much.
The groin muscles are a difficult one to foam roll, so I don't want to drag you in that direction. It's usually for specific groin strains. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, next question.
Got a question about the foam roll, because you said to use it before doing strengthening exercises, but should you use it before stretching as well?
So the best time to use the foam roller is straight after a training session. Muscles are at its tightest. So if you're doing a group training session fencing, it would be great at the end if you all jumped on the foam roller while you're saying goodbye to each other. That's the best time. However, if you don't and you do it at home, you want to try and do it as close as possible to training. If you're doing strength work, then ideally you would have done it so well in the previous time that you wouldn't need to worry about doing it before the strength session. So you have to flip it over. The foam roll is a preventative device when the muscle's at its tightest. Whereas if you try and save the day before your next training session, yes, you'll get a result, but it won't be as effective because the muscles have already been tight for a longer time. So the best foam roller people will often touch on the foam roller before a really important training session, but they'll be very disciplined after training when they're at their tightest, because they've worked out when they foam roll on an evening after training, they always wake up looser the next day, which makes sense. And therefore, on the basis that most people stay in their house every night, particularly during lockdown, there's no excuse. But it then takes the stretching question out of the way, because if you've done everything right, then stretching actually isn't that important anyway. So you might do a bit of a gentle stretch in the context of your warm-up before training, but then we would support the evidence that would say you're not really changing your injury risk. You're just feeling good about stretching, and that's fine. But I would do a dynamic warm-up and go and run around the court and do 20 or 30 gentle lunges, then stand there and do a quad stretch before Laszlo's training session, because I know which one's going to make me less injured.
Right. Are there different sizes of the rolls? Is there anything I need to pay attention to if I want to get one?
No, the density is the key. So this is what we call the knobbly, the more harder core ones. There's a medium and then a soft. The soft one we don't tend to use anymore, because we find even the person that really struggles with the concept that they have to find their pain, once they get used to it, the soft ones often do become too soft and they lose their effect. So we tend to say medium density working up to bigger density. And a lot of people end up having one that's a little bit more generous for the really tight muscles, like the ITB at the side of the leg that people will know about. That's really tough because it's a skinny muscle. But then that same soft roller will be no good on your hamstring, because you need to have the knobbles to find the hamstring. So yeah, it's not the size, it's more the density and the texture.
Got it. Thank you.
And we'll talk to Beth, because I know we've done it with other classes where we've actually run the foam roller class. You just do it once. We cover 20 muscles from head to toe. And once you've done that once, you don't need to do it again, because you'll know everything about foam rolling. And a lot of people have thrown away the foam roll historically because they were just doing it so badly that they were never feeling it, because they were never going towards the knots. Or conversely, they found the right knot. It was 100 out of 10 pain. So they got the foam roller and they threw it out the window, even though the answer was there in front of them. And we say that if 10 seconds you want to throw that roller out the window, then give yourself a pat on the back. And next time, it won't be that, because it's like a cake. There's the icing and there's the base. You just got to work your way down. And if you do it regularly after training, it reduces so quickly.
Did you say that you could use it for headaches?
Yeah.
How?
So the neck patient, if the headache is related to the neck, that's the headache that we know is coming from the neck, and the vast majority are, believe it or not, very true reflection of migraine incidence is a lot lower than what people think. But if I had a neck stiffness that was causing a headache, one of the ones we show people in the foam roller class is to lie safely on the roller. So I'm very supported. And if my headache happened to be on my right side, I just turn my head onto that roller. It's a bit like having a physio press your neck, and it would uncover some neck tightness. And more often than not, that would be the same headache produced as what the person has had forever. And then once they loosen off the neck muscles, then the subsequent days would give them a clue as to whether their headache was a migraine or a neck headache or other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good one to try.
Something the foam roller is have for if I driving a long drive, maybe 4 or 5 hours in a row, and is had for if I after the driving I make a stretching on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would consider that as a bit like a training session that happens to be 5 hours long in the context of the neck. And we would prefer you to lie down on a roller to loosen it off than to try and do some gentle stretching that won't change the length of the muscle, because all that's going to do is just keep your head moving to whatever it is at the time.
The best if I keep it one of them in the car, just in case.
Nearby. Yeah. But then the strength work will come in. That's what people have to understand, is that the rolling creates the platform of looseness to allow your muscles to get strong. And that's why it works so well. The people at foam roll uncover more time to do strength work. They then get stronger. They know how to manage the tightness of that strength work. So they just jump up to the next step. And it's pretty much what you see. And when you go to things like gymnastics competitions, every gymnast at the national level will have a foam roller under their arm. And that is a lot of it's psychological. They want to feel loose and supple, which goes with the sport, but it's no coincidence at the top level, they're all using a foam roller very openly, transparently, and they're not hiding it. It's accepted. Question there, Stuart. I think it was a good one. Let me just check there. What's what I thought? Any advantage using a lacrosse ball over a foam roller? So yeah, good question to have. Hang on a sec. I must get John's question done next.
Does John?
Yeah. The spiky ball of the lacrosse ball is just the extension of the firm foam roller. So the hamstring that we talked about for Simone. What's another one? I might get someone to use a ball under their shoulder blade if I felt like they just weren't hitting the spot. There we go. Thank you, Beth. And the backside muscle also responds to it, but we would always insist that someone had good foam roller technique before they went to there, because they might get a nasty shock when they actually use it really well and the pain's 100 out of 10 and they can't manage it. It's almost like they've gone too deep. Whereas if you're on the foam roller and you know how to turn your body to one angle, then you can find that pain, and then the next extension would be going to the ball. Yeah. Now, the John's one's a good one. Muscle tracking from the front knee, and you had a torn ACL. Welcome to the club. I don't have a cruise ship in one of mine. John, I better ask you, have you had a reconstruction or not?
He's shaking his head, no.
Okay, sorry, I've not got him on the screen. Yep, that's fine. Yep, good. Neither of you. Have you had it removed?
Sorry, John, I keep...
Have you had the cruise ship removed?
No, I haven't had any surgery on it yet. It's hanging on by a thread, and I'm scared for when it does go, to be honest.
Yeah. So you want to strengthen so it doesn't go, but accepting you're in a twisting sport. So do you have a really aggressive strength program on that knee?
I don't at all, and it seems like maybe once or twice a year I lose stability in it, and I'll keel over on that knee.
Yeah. So you've got a window of opportunity that is literally the thread hanging on. I ruptured my cruciate 13 years ago playing football. I, at the time, thought it was the worst thing that ever happened. It was clearly the best, because I needed an exit route out of football. I wanted to be a runner and a triathlete. And at the time, I couldn't have the reconstruction because we were about to travel the world. Had it removed. And since that day, I've not had 1 second of pain or instability. I've done 5 Ironman triathlons, but not just triathlons, but cross-country running. But the textbook says you can't run in the mud without a cruciate. I wouldn't even tell you which knee it was. My leg is so strong. So if you've got evidence that your cruciate's still there, albeit hanging on, you want to build that strength up to take away your fear of rupturing it, because to be fair, assuming you've fenced a fair bit to be on this particular Zoom call, you probably should have ruptured it by now. So therefore, let's get some more strength work in, and that psychological should be like mine, where yes, I know that if the wrong circumstances were there, that I would have an unstable knee, but I haven't got no cruciate because it's been removed, and I've got perfect stability. So you've just got to go with the fact that a consultant didn't want to reconstruct that cruciate until now, and it's your job to make sure that doesn't need to happen.
That's the best news you could have given me.
It's common sense, because I'd rather have a cruciate reconstruction after a period of strength work as a fencer and then say I did everything I could, rather than have an operation, not do the strength work pre, have poor strength after, re-rupture, then everyone goes, well, that didn't work. And that's the biggest single cause of failed operations, is the lack of strength work pre-operation. But again, if you fenced with this injury, you've got some strength there. You now need to build on it.